Hogwarts Castle lay wrapped in a thick blanket of night. The moon hung low outside the tall windows, spilling silver light across the cold stone corridors. Most of the castle was still, as though it too were sleeping. Portraits with eyes closed, staircases frozen in place, even Peeves the poltergeist suspiciously absent. The only sounds were the occasional crackle from a dying torch and the faint sigh of the wind sneaking in through narrow gaps in the walls. The air smelled faintly of old stone, polished wood, and the lingering scent of candle wax. Every echo and shadow seemed to carry a secret, as if the castle itself were listening to the quiet footsteps of anyone daring enough to wander its halls. But in the Gryffindor common room, two figures were very much awake. Fred Weasley sat slouched in a deep red armchair, the firelight casting warm flickers across his mischievous grin. His wand spun lazily between his fingers, catching the light and glimmering like a tiny, wand-shaped meteor. Across from him, George leaned forward over the low table, eyes fixed on a piece of parchment that glimmered faintly under the firelight. It was the Marauder's map, showing the faint, shifting outlines of students, ghosts, and the occasional cat moving silently through the castle. "Right," George whispered, tapping the parchment with the tip of his wand. "We've got Filch patrolling near the library for the next 20 minutes, Mrs. Norris lurking by the third-floor corridor, and Peeves floating about near the trophy room, which leaves..." "The perfect opportunity," Fred finished, leaning forward with a spark in his eyes, "for our dear little surprise in the Great Hall." The identical grins that spread across their faces could only mean one thing: mischief, planned with precision and a little bit of genius. Fred reached into his pocket and produced a small tin box. It clicked open to reveal a handful of shimmering, faintly glowing spheres, each pulsing like a captured star. They smelled faintly of peppermint and something else, something magical that made them almost irresistible to touch, even knowing what they were meant to do. "Luminous dung bombs," Fred whispered proudly. "Fresh from our latest batch. Took hours to get them just right. These beauties don't just stink, they glow. Glorious chaos." George chuckled under his breath. "Ah, just the thing to make breakfast tomorrow. Unforgettable." Preparing the first step. They rose quietly, their footsteps muffled by the thick rugs of the common room. The portraits of Gryffindor's famous ancestors watched them as they moved. Some seemed to smile, some frowned, and one muttered sleepily about how students never learned to sit still. The fat lady stirred as they approached, stretching her painted arms lazily, but remained silent as they slipped through the portrait hole into the dim corridor beyond. The castle's night air was different from the day, cooler, heavier, and carrying a faint scent of damp stone. Their footsteps echoed softly along the walls, blending with the occasional creak of the enchanted portraits adjusting in their frames. Moonlight poured through the tall windows, illuminating patches of the corridor floor, the edges of tapestries, and the occasional dust motes dancing lazily in the air. "Stairs or shortcut?" Fred asked, his voice barely audible. "Shortcut," George replied without hesitation. "Through the tapestry by Barnabas the Barmy. We'll shave off a good 10 minutes." They paused at a corner, listening carefully. The faint shuffle of footsteps echoed from above. Filch, perhaps, moving his lantern along the upper corridors. They pressed against the wall, silent and still, Even the slightest movement would give them away. They waited until the sound faded before continuing their stealthy progress. Mini detour, the owlery. Fred had an idea, a small test for a prank he wanted to send up the next morning. They slipped into a side corridor that led to the staircase up to the owlery. The climb spiraled upward, winding around. The stone walls. The air grew colder, carrying the faint scent of feathers and old parchment from owl cages. The light of the moon stretched across the walls, creating strange shadows that seemed almost alive. When they reached the owlery, dozens of owls blinked sleepily at them from their perches. Some ruffled their feathers in mild annoyance, and a few hooted softly. Fred produced a small, folded note from his pocket, the kind that would make a teacher's eyes widen with surprise in the morning. With a quick flick of his wand, neat handwriting appeared across the parchment. Dear Professor McGonagall, I am pleased to inform you that you have been selected as the 202nd winner of the International Wizard Hat Design Contest. George snorted quietly. You're terrible. Terribly brilliant, Fred corrected, tying the note to the leg of a particularly grouchy-looking owl. The bird blinked once, then took off silently into the night sky, carrying their prank like a whisper across the castle grounds. They lingered for a few more moments, watching moonlight scatter across the owlery windows, casting silvery reflections over the feathers of sleeping owls. One particularly curious barn owl hooted softly and tilted its head, as though approving the twins' audacity. The Tapestry Passage. The twins returned to their main route, stopping before the tapestry of Barnabas the Barmy. Fred gently tugged at the heavy fabric, revealing a narrow, dimly lit passageway. The smell of damp earth and age-old stone filled their noses. Their footsteps echoed softly against the walls. Every step seemed amplified. Every small sound like a shout in the stillness of the castle. Fred leaned down, observing a tiny spider weaving a web near the floor. Careful, he whispered to George. Wouldn't want to ruin its midnight snack. George chuckled quietly. Barnabas must have hated spiders. They continued down the passageway slowly, savoring the silence. The shadows seemed to stretch longer the deeper they went, curling around their feet, dancing along the walls. Occasionally, the faint glimmer of a stray torch flickered, casting long, moving shadows that made the passage feel alive. They paused several times, listening for the distant creak of Filch's steps or the faint hiss of a ghost drifting through the corridors. The great hall set up, opening. Emerging from the hidden passage, the twins stepped cautiously into the far end of the great hall. The room was vast, shadows stretching long under the enchanted night sky. The tables gleamed faintly in the pale silver light, candles floating high above, barely flickering, and the polished floor reflected the stars cast by the magical ceiling. The silence was profound, broken only by the soft rustle of their robes as they moved. You take the left side, Fred whispered, crouching low. I'll handle the teacher's table. George nodded, eyes gleaming. The first luminous dung bomb was placed under a bench with meticulous care. Its faint glow pulsed like a heartbeat, teasing the darkness without giving itself away. They worked slowly, savoring every step, listening intently for any distant sound, a creaking floorboard, a distant cough, the telltale scuff of Filch's shoes. Peeves makes his appearance. As the twins carefully adjusted the first luminous dung bomb under the long Gryffindor bench, a sudden giggle echoed from above. The sound bounced off the tall ceilings, reverberating through the cavernous hall, sending tiny ripples across the polished floor. Peeves was floating along the balcony, juggling a set of stolen silver candlesticks. His wide, mischievous grin gleamed in the faint moonlight. "Evening, little chaos makers," he sang out, twirling in midair. "What's this then? A secret little midnight party?" Fred froze for a heartbeat, eyes narrowing. "Give him one of the small ones," he whispered to George. "Let's see what he does with it." George handed him a luminous dung bomb. Peeves caught it effortlessly, holding it aloft as he twirled and laughed. Then, with a mischievous flick, he sent it floating away into the far corner of the hall. The sphere landed softly on the floor, glowing faintly before fizzing into tiny motes of light that scattered like fireflies. The twins stifled their laughter, careful not to draw attention from any wandering ghosts. Peeves gave a theatrical bow and disappeared into the shadows, already plotting his own little chaos for the morning. "Did he just approve it?" George whispered, eyes wide. "More like signed off on our little masterpiece," Fred replied, smirking. "Multiple mini pranks." The twins continued their careful setup. Under each bench along the sides of the great hall, they placed enchanted quills. These weren't ordinary quills. Each one was rigged to write the silliest, most nonsensical messages when anyone tried to use it. Some would draw upside-down letters. Others would scrawl, "I solemnly swear I am a little pancake," across the parchment. Fred paused, squatting low to the floor, and whispered, "Do you think anyone will notice the extra sparkle dust?" George sprinkled a faint trail of powdered glitter along the center of the tables. The tiny motes shimmered faintly, catching the silver light like fireflies suspended in air. "They'll think the stars have fallen right onto the table," he said softly, barely holding back a laugh. Next came the confetti capsules. The twins crouched low, placing tiny vials that would explode harmlessly with a puff of multicolored confetti when touched. Each placement was calculated under the chairs of the tallest students, near the teachers' seats, even along the edges where the house elves might set up the morning breakfast trays. They paused to admire their handiwork, ears straining for any sign of approaching footsteps. Moonlight filtered through the high windows, illuminating tiny specks of dust that drifted lazily in the air. Each moment was stretched, deliberate, their anticipation growing. Near misses and tension. As they moved toward the center of the hall to finish the final touches, a faint noise made them freeze. Filch's shadow appeared along the corridor outside, lanterns swinging slowly in the dim light. The twins pressed themselves against the side of a table, holding their breath. Every heartbeat thundered in their ears. The shadow paused, sniffed the air, and crept along, then disappeared around a corner. "Close one," whispered George. "Nothing like a near miss to keep us sharp," Fred replied, suppressing a grin. They lingered in the shadows for a few moments, their minds racing with silent laughter at the chaos that would greet the morning. Then, with careful, measured steps, they returned to their final placements, adjusting the sparkle dust and ensuring each capsule was perfectly poised. The teacher's table. Fred crouched low near the long table where the professors would sit. This required delicate precision. Any misplacement could lead to disaster, or worse, discovery. He arranged a row of dung bombs, each separated by just enough space so the explosion of light and scent would be evenly distributed. George worked on the enchantments that would trigger when anyone sat down. Some seats were rigged to play faint giggles or the sound of snoring, while others would emit soft, harmless sparks that popped gently in the morning light. "Do you think McGonagall will notice the glitter?" George whispered. "She'll notice the chaos," Fred said, "and then she'll notice the glitter. Perfection." They took a moment to step back and survey their handiwork. The great hall, silent and gleaming under the moonlight, now held tiny secrets in every shadow, every table, every bench. Extended reflections and dialogue. The twins paused for a longer reflection. Fred's mind wandered to past pranks. The time he'd filled the Slytherin common room hallway with frogs, the enchanted fireworks at the Quidditch pitch, and the countless confetti-filled capsules they'd scattered throughout the castle over the years. "Remember third year?" Fred whispered, a grin tugging at his lips. "Frogs in Slytherin. Malfoy nearly fainted." George laughed softly. "Nearly?" He screamed louder than the frogs. "Imagine if we'd had these glitter vials back then," Fred said, eyes gleaming. "He would have been covered from head to toe." The twins chuckled quietly, savoring the shared memory, careful not to disturb the silence of the hall. Their minds were buzzing, not just with the thrill of the night's plan, but with the pure delight of plotting and anticipating chaos. The long return journey. With their mischief fully in place, Fred and George began retracing their steps through the castle. The corridors now seemed longer, more mysterious. Shadows twisted and flickered under the moonlight, every echo amplified in the stillness. They paused at narrow corners to listen, the faintest creak of a floorboard sending a jolt of adrenaline through them. Occasionally, a mouse or bat scuttled past, and the twins held their breath until it disappeared. Every step was deliberate, careful, but each one stretched the night longer, heightening anticipation. They took small detours, checking hidden corners, ensuring no charm had shifted, adjusting a tiny confetti capsule here, a sparkle powder there. The castle felt alive around them, almost approving their careful mischief, its ancient stones pulsing softly with magic. Many encounters on the way. As they moved past the tapestry hall, nearly headless Nick drifted silently through a corridor. His spectral eyes glimmered faintly in the moonlight. "Evening, Nick," Fred whispered. "Good evening, Fred, George," the ghost replied softly, bowing slightly. "I trust your midnight activities are harmless?" "Completely," George said, grinning. "We're just spreading a little light and laughter." Nick tilted his head, the silver chain of his head rattling gently. "Light and laughter indeed. Well, do be careful." The twins watched him drift down the hallway, a fleeting shadow, before continuing their careful progress. Final corridor reflections. By the time they neared Gryffindor Tower, the twins slowed, savoring the lingering thrill of their adventure. The moonlight cast long reflections on the floor, dust motes danced lazily, and a faint scent of wax and stone clung to their robes. "Tomorrow," George whispered, "is going to be magnificent." "Magnificent, chaotic, and utterly brilliant," Fred replied. They paused at the portrait hole, catching their breaths, feeling the quiet anticipation settle over them like a soft blanket. Their hearts still raced with excitement, yet the calm of the common room awaited them, a place to rest, reflect, and finally sleep. Back in Gryffindor Tower. Finally, they slipped back into the Gryffindor common room. The fire had burned low, shadows stretching across the familiar furniture. The twins sank into their chairs, exhausted but grinning. Their minds replayed the setup, each mini prank, each sparkle of light. The night was theirs, and tomorrow would be a day of delightful chaos. They sat silently for a moment, watching the fire, listening to the distant hum of the castle, imagining the reactions that awaited at breakfast. "Sleep?" George asked softly. "Sleep," Fred agreed. "And tomorrow, we watch the magic happen." The twins finally closed their eyes, the thrill of the night lingering like a secret perfume in the quiet of Hogwarts. Dawn breaks over Hogwarts. The first rays of morning sunlight crept lazily over the horizon, filtering through the tall windows of Hogwarts. The castle seemed almost serene, draped in the soft glow of dawn. Outside, the grounds were quiet, the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind the only sound. Inside, however, a storm of laughter, confusion, and magic waited to awaken the castle's inhabitants. The great hall, which had been silent and gleaming under moonlight just hours before, now held its secrets ready to burst into chaos. The carefully placed luminous dung bombs, enchanted quills, sparkle powders, and confetti capsules all awaited the first touch, the first unsuspecting student to trigger a cascade of harmless mayhem. Fred and George, still nestled in their armchairs by the dying fire in the common room, stirred as the first sounds of students beginning to stir floated faintly from the corridors. They shared a quiet glance, anticipation sparkling in their eyes. "Do you think they're ready?" Fred whispered. George's grin stretched wide. "They have no idea what's coming." The journey to breakfast. By mid-morning, the twins, dressed in their usual Gryffindor robes, padded quietly down the corridors, heading toward the Great Hall. The corridors were alive with whispers, sleepy yawns, and the faint sound of shoes scuffing along the stone floors. Every step felt heavy with anticipation. As they approached the entrance to the Great Hall, they paused, listening. The soft murmurs of students began to rise, curious, puzzled voices echoing down the long hall. Some students noticed the faint glow of the first luminous dung bombs under the benches. Others spotted subtle flashes of sparkle dust on the tables, glittering like scattered stars. Fred tapped George lightly on the shoulder. "Ready?" "As I'll ever be," George replied, eyes glinting. Together they stepped into the hall, trying to appear casual, blending in with the early arrivals. The first reactions. The chaos began almost immediately. A first-year Ravenclaw, curious about the glow beneath her bench, reached down to examine it. Instantly, the luminous dung bomb activated, puffing tiny sparks and releasing a faint peppermint scent. She shrieked in surprise, stepping back as her friends turned to see what had happened. "Did you see that?" one whispered, eyes wide. "It's glowing." A nearby Gryffindor, distracted by the enchanted quill, watched in astonishment as the pen began scrawling nonsensical messages across the parchment. The letters flipped upside down, looped in spirals, and occasionally spelled out funny phrases like, "I am a giant pudding," or "Beware the dancing toadstools." Fred and George stifled their laughter behind a nearby column, exchanging a victorious glance. Every small sound, a gasp, a giggle, a whispered, "What is happening?" fueled their excitement. Teachers' reactions. Professor McGonagall was the first adult to notice the peculiar shimmer of the sparkle dust along the tables. Her sharp eyes narrowed as she approached the source, her hands clasped behind her back. The first luminous dung bomb burst into faint, harmless light at her feet, startling her just enough for her glasses to slip slightly down her nose. "Mr. Weasley, Mr. Weasley," she exclaimed, voice tinged with equal parts sternness and exasperation. Her eyes swept across the hall, taking in the enchanted quills, tiny confetti explosions, and scattered magical glimmers. Fred bowed ever so slightly, mischievous grin in place. "Good morning, Professor McGonagall. Lovely day, isn't it?" George followed suit, equally innocent. "Beautiful morning, Professor. Crisp, bright, and quite magical, wouldn't you say?" McGonagall pinched the bridge of her nose. "Magical indeed. I shall be expecting explanations by breakfast's end. Students, join the fun." By now, the students were thoroughly engaged in the chaos. Confetti capsules burst with soft pops, scattering tiny clouds of glitter across robes, hair, and parchment. The sparkle dust caused faint glimmers to trail across the polished floor, reflecting sunlight like miniature shooting stars. First years ran in delight and surprise, laughing, pointing, and carefully stepping over glowing spheres. Older students tried to maintain composure, but found themselves smirking at the sheer creativity of the mayhem. Even the occasional prefect struggled to keep a straight face, occasionally muttering, "That's so, Fred and George." A small group of Hufflepuffs noticed a luminous dung bomb under a table, carefully prodding it with their wands. The moment it ignited in gentle sparks, a faint peppermint scent filled the air, causing a chorus of laughter and playful groans. Fred whispered to George, "They're loving it, just as we planned." George nodded. "Best breakfast ever." Peeves returns. Of course, chaos could never truly exist without Peeves. The poltergeist floated down from the rafters, giggling and twirling in the sunlight streaming through the windows. He began flicking harmless sparks at students, causing hair to stand on end or robes to puff slightly. In comical ways. "Peeves, not too much," Fred whispered. "We don't want him to ruin the timing." Peeves winked, continuing his playful antics, careful to add to the overall pandemonium rather than steal the spotlight. His mischievous energy amplified the laughter and confusion in the hall, adding another layer of controlled chaos that only a Weasley prank could harness. Extended observations. Fred and George took a moment to observe their handiwork from a distance. Their eyes scanned the hall, sparkle dust trailing across the center tables, catching the morning light. Confetti clouds floating gently down from hidden capsules. Students jumping in surprise at luminous dung bombs, squeals of delight and shock mingling. Professors attempting to maintain authority while subtly shaking their heads in disbelief. "Look at it all," Fred whispered, his voice low. "Every tiny detail, perfect." George nodded, letting his gaze linger on the reactions. "All the planning, the patience, the timing, it's like watching magic come alive." Quiet reflections amid the chaos. Even in the midst of controlled chaos, the twins allowed themselves brief moments of reflection. They recalled their early years at Hogwarts, sneaking past Filch, attempting smaller pranks that had often failed, and learning the delicate art of timing and precision. Each prank now felt like the culmination of years of experience, careful observation, and innate mischief. Fred thought about their father, Arthur Weasley, and the quiet pride that must hide behind his easygoing laughter. George considered their mother, Molly, and the subtle balance between exasperation and affection she displayed when she discovered their earlier antics. These thoughts didn't diminish their delight. Instead, they added layers of warmth, grounding the chaos in the heart of family and tradition. Preparing for the next wave. Even as laughter and exclamations filled the hall, the twins moved silently, checking a few final details. They adjusted the confetti capsules that hadn't yet popped, repositioned the sparkle dust in faint trails for maximum effect, and ensured the luminous dung bombs remained perfectly poised for discovery. The students, unaware of the subtle manipulations happening around them, continued to explore the hall, triggering mini pranks one by one. Fred and George exchanged silent, satisfied glances. The morning had unfolded just as they had imagined, a delicate dance of surprise, delight, and harmless chaos. The calm before lessons. Eventually, as the initial wave of pranks settled, the hall grew slightly quieter. Students were laughing, chatting, and carefully navigating the lingering magical effects. Professors were observing with a mixture of amusement and exasperation, trying to restore order without dampening the mood. Fred and George finally retreated to a quiet corner near the staff table, sitting on a bench with tired, triumphant smiles. The sun's rays now fully lit the hall, bouncing off polished floors and glittering confetti, creating an almost surreal shimmer over the scene. "We did it," Fred whispered, stretching his arms. "Masterful," George agreed. "Every step, every sparkle, perfect." They leaned back, allowing themselves a rare moment of stillness amid the aftermath of mischief. Hogwarts, alive with magic, laughter, and tiny glimmers of chaos, seemed to hum approvingly around them. Post-breakfast debrief. The Great Hall had quieted slightly after the initial flurry of activity. Students continued to giggle softly at the lingering sparkle dust and occasional confetti that drifted lazily from hidden capsules. Professors, now more composed, patrolled the room with cautious curiosity, occasionally raising an eyebrow at a misplaced quill or a faint puff of peppermint-scented sparkles. Fred and George found themselves in a secluded corner near the entrance, leaning casually against the wall. The twins watched as students cautiously navigated their way around glowing spheres and tiny explosions of harmless confetti. George nudged Fred lightly. "You know, we might need to expand production. Hogwarts is almost too small for the sheer genius of our ideas." Fred laughed quietly, careful not to draw attention. "Too small? Ha! Hogwarts could barely contain our last year's fireworks. This is just a warm-up." They exchanged a conspiratorial glance, silently agreeing that the morning chaos was only the beginning of a day filled with possibilities. Lingering mischief. As students and professors adjusted to the initial pranks, the twins quietly moved through the hall, inspecting the results. A small capsule had landed under a first year's bench, still untriggered. Fred crouched, gently tapping it with the tip of his wand. With a soft pop, confetti erupted, causing the student to leap back with a startled yelp. George stifled a laugh. Perfection. Every reaction exactly as intended. They moved along the tables, sprinkling tiny amounts of additional sparkle dust and adjusting a few quills. Every gesture was deliberate, ensuring that the pranks continued to amuse without crossing into chaos that could cause real trouble. A group of second years stumbled upon a small, luminous dung bomb tucked beneath the edge of a chair. The faint glow caught their attention immediately, and when it ignited, they shrieked with laughter, pointing at the glowing peppermint scent puff that lingered in the air. Fred whispered to George, "They're learning early. Mischief is a gift, George. Never forget that." George nodded solemnly, though a grin tugged at his lips. A gift, indeed. Professor's reactions. Professor McGonagall, ever vigilant, approached the twins once more. Mr. Weasley, she said, her tone a careful mixture of admonishment and curiosity. I see the results of your ingenuity." Fred and George straightened, faces the picture of innocence. "Good morning, Professor," Fred said smoothly. "We were simply observing magical reactions in real time." George added, "Yes, purely for educational purposes." McGonagall's sharp eyes scanned the hall. "Educational purposes, I see. Very well. I shall be expecting detailed reports on all effects observed by the end of the day." The twins exchanged a barely perceptible wink. "Of course, Professor," George whispered under his breath. Student reactions. Throughout the morning, the students continued to discover the small, hidden pranks. A Gryffindor fifth year, intrigued by a sparkling trail along the tables, followed it carefully, only to find that an enchanted quill had begun writing, "Beware of the ticklish unicorns," in looping letters across the parchment. Nearby, a group of Hufflepuffs watched in awe as a small confetti cloud erupted from a capsule tucked behind a bench. Laughter spread like wildfire, catching the attention of curious students from other tables. Even the oldest students couldn't help but smile at the ingenuity. "Classic Weasley," one whispered, shaking his head in disbelief. "Absolutely classic." Fred and George lingered nearby, observing the reactions with satisfaction. Every squeal, gasp, and laugh felt like a small reward for hours of planning and careful execution. A quiet walk through the castle. By late morning, with most of the pranks having been discovered, the twins decided to take a quiet walk through the castle. They meandered through familiar corridors, their footsteps echoing softly against the stone. Occasionally, a faint sparkle from a misplaced dust trail glimmered in the sunlight streaming through high windows, reminding them of the morning's success. Passing the tapestry hall, Fred nudged George. "Remember third year? Nearly got caught in the Slytherin dungeon." George chuckled. "And yet, here we are, still free, still brilliant." They paused briefly at a window overlooking the grounds. The lawn was bathed in soft sunlight, dew sparkling like tiny diamonds on each blade of grass. The twins felt a fleeting sense of calm, a pause in the otherwise constant rhythm of mischief. Afternoon antics. Even as the day progressed, the twins couldn't resist subtle, harmless pranks. A tiny charm on a quill would make the letters hop and skip across parchment when a student tried to write. A small capsule under a chair would gently release a puff of glitter, startling the occupant without causing harm. Fred whispered. "It's an art form, really. The balance between surprise and chaos." George nodded, eyes scanning the hall for the perfect opportunities. Precision, timing, and subtlety. Never forget that. They moved from classroom to classroom, adjusting minor charms and leaving behind faint traces of sparkle dust. Students, unaware of the source, found themselves delightfully distracted throughout the day, laughter following them like a gentle trail. Evening approaches. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting golden light across the castle, the twins returned to the Gryffindor common room. The fire had been rekindled, flickering warmly against the stone walls. Chairs and rugs were bathed in the soft glow, creating a sense of cozy calm after the day's controlled chaos. Fred flopped into an armchair, stretching his arms with a satisfied sigh. Another day of genius complete. George sank into the opposite chair, grinning. Hogwarts may never be the same, and yet, somehow, it feels just right. They spent a few quiet moments observing the fire, letting the warmth seep into their bones. The scent of polished wood, old stone, and lingering magic filled the room, mingling with the faint peppermint scent from the morning's pranks. Reflection on Mischief. The twins reflected on the day's events, the thrill of planning, the anticipation of each reaction, and the satisfaction of observing their ideas come alive. Every squeal, laugh, and startled gasp had been perfectly timed, a testament to their skill and creativity. Fred mused quietly. Mischief is more than just fun. It's an art. It's timing, precision, and the joy of watching the world respond to a little chaos. George nodded. And it's shared joy. Every reaction, every laugh, it's all connected. Hogwarts feels alive when you see it like this. They sat in companionable silence, watching the fire, letting the warmth and quiet of the evening settle around them. The day had been filled with laughter, creativity, and the kind of magic that wasn't taught in classrooms, but felt in the heart. Preparing for night. As darkness fell outside, the twins prepared for another quiet night. They tidied small traces of their pranks still lingering in the common room, making it look untouched, just as it had in the early hours before the night's adventures. The flickering fire cast long shadows, making the room feel both familiar and magical. Fred leaned back, stretching his arms. Tomorrow, we plan again. Perhaps something even grander. George smiled. But for tonight, we rest. The castle has spoken, and it approves of our work. The twins settled into their chairs, eyes drifting closed. The soft crackle of the fire, the distant echoes of the castle settling into night, and the faint remnants of the day's sparkle dust combined into a perfect, peaceful lullaby. Even in the quiet, their minds danced with possibilities, ideas for pranks yet to come, small touches of chaos waiting patiently for the right moment. Hogwarts, alive with magic and laughter, seemed to hum softly, a living witness to the Weasley twins' brilliance. Twilight settles over Hogwarts. Outside the tall windows of the Gryffindor common room, the last remnants of sunlight faded into a soft twilight glow. The sky shifted from gold to lavender, and then to the deep indigo of early night. Stars began to twinkle faintly above the castle turrets, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of wet grass from the grounds. Hogwarts seemed to exhale slowly, as though the castle itself was stretching and settling after the day's lively events. Inside, the common room felt calm yet alive. The fire burned low, embers casting a warm, flickering light across the stone walls and worn wooden furniture. The twins, still seated in their armchairs, let their eyes drift around the familiar room. Every detail, the tapestry of Gryffindor's founders, the scattered cushions, the faint smell of wood smoke and dust, felt imbued with magic. Fred broke the silence first, voice soft. "Do you ever think about how many nights we've spent here, George? Planning, hiding, laughing, just the two of us against the castle." George leaned back, resting his arms over the chair. "It's like Hogwarts itself is a stage," he said, "and we're the actors. Or maybe the directors." A quiet chuckle escaped him. "Or the chaos coordinators, more like." Fred laughed softly, but it was a quiet, satisfied laugh, the kind that carries both pride and nostalgia. "Chaos coordinators, I like that. You think anyone else would ever get the timing right?" George shook his head. "Not a chance. Only us." The common room settles. The room grew quieter with every passing moment. The distant echo of students returning from their evening activities drifted faintly down the corridors. Some voices called for friends. A few laughed quietly over shared jokes. Occasionally, a soft creak from the stone floors reminded the twins that even when the castle seemed empty, it was very much alive. Fred's eyes lingered on the portrait of the fat lady. She hung quietly, her painted face serene in the glow of the fire. "She doesn't even know half of what we've done tonight," he whispered. George grinned. "And if she did, well, she'd faint, or at least threaten to throw us out." The twins' laughter was soft, careful not to echo too loudly through the castle. It mingled with the gentle crackle of the fire and the occasional distant hoot of an owl, creating a symphony of calm, mischievous energy. Revisiting past memories. As the night deepened, Fred leaned back in his chair, gazing into the fire. His voice softened. "Do you remember third year? That time we tried to turn Filch's office into a mini forest. He was so close to catching us. Almost." George's grin softened into a nostalgic smile. "And the look on your face when Mrs. Norris nearly saw you hiding behind the filing cabinets. Priceless. We were terrified, but somehow it felt perfect." Fred nodded, thinking back. It wasn't just the pranks, though. It was the planning, the secrecy, the thrill of the unknown. Every step, every glance, every heartbeat. George sighed softly. "It's strange, isn't it? How those small moments feel bigger now, more alive." The twins fell into a comfortable silence, letting the warmth of the fire and the memories fill the room. Outside, the wind whispered through the castle turrets, carrying faint echoes of their laughter from past adventures. Small acts of kindness, hidden in mischief. Even in their mischief, the twins had always found ways to leave behind small moments of kindness. Fred reached over to a low table and picked up a tiny, luminous dung bomb that hadn't yet been discovered. He smiled. "Remember the first years? I think we gave them a day to remember, not just chaos, a little wonder too." George nodded, his eyes softening. "It's funny how magic works that way. Mischief and joy, side by side. Sometimes you can't have one without the other." The twins spent a few minutes quietly rearranging small details of the room, ensuring cushions were fluffed, a forgotten quill left perfectly upright, and that the fire glimmered just right. It was as if the castle itself had guided their hands, weaving a gentle, comforting rhythm into the night. The castle at night. Outside the windows, the castle grounds were bathed in moonlight. The lake shimmered faintly in silver, and the forbidden forest stood in quiet majesty, trees silhouetted against the night sky. The castle walls, ancient and steadfast, seemed to hum softly, carrying the stories of countless students, adventures, and magical nights just like this one. Fred and George sat together, watching the world outside. "You know," Fred said, voice soft, "Hogwarts never sleeps. Even when we do, it's awake, breathing, listening, waiting." George nodded. "And we're part of it. Every prank, every plan, every laugh, it all leaves a mark. Tiny, maybe invisible to some, but it's there, always." The twins allowed themselves to simply exist in that quiet moment, the castle alive around them, their hearts full of memories, magic, and anticipation. The night before new adventures. As the clock in the tower ticked onward, Fred and George allowed their minds to wander to future mischief. Ideas for new pranks, experiments with glittering powders, enchanted quills, and tiny magical surprises danced in their thoughts. Fred whispered, "Tomorrow, bigger, brighter, more magical. Hogwarts won't know what hit it." George laughed softly. "Of course, but tonight, we rest. The castle has seen our brilliance. Let it dream with us." They leaned back, closing their eyes, letting the warmth of the fire, the gentle hum of the castle, and the soft night sounds lull them into a state of calm contentment. Their minds, however, remained alight with possibilities, plans for adventures yet to come, and the quiet joy of shared mischief. Gentle closing reflections. Even as they drifted toward sleep, the twins reflected on the balance between chaos and calm, laughter and thoughtfulness. They remembered past adventures, the lessons of timing and precision, and the small, unexpected joys that came from watching their pranks unfold. Fred murmured, almost to himself, "Magic isn't just spells or potions. It's in moments like these." George's voice was soft, almost a whisper. "It's in laughter, friendship, and the quiet after the storm of fun." Outside, the moon sailed across the sky, casting gentle light into the common room. The fire crackled once more before settling into glowing embers. Hogwarts, ancient and alive, seemed to breathe with the twins, wrapping them in warmth, magic, and a sense of infinite possibility. For tonight, the castle rested, the twins rested, and the echoes of laughter and sparkles from their day's adventures lingered like a gentle, twinkling lullaby, promising more magic to come. Closing scene. Fred and George finally slipped fully into sleep, their minds dreaming of future adventures, hidden pranks, and the endless possibilities Hogwarts offered. Outside, the castle lay quiet, the stars twinkling like tiny winks in approval. The world was calm, the night deep, and the magic of Hogwarts wrapped around the twins like a soft, protective cloak. For now, mischief rested, but only until dawn.